Harry Potter pressed his ear against the thin wood of his cupboard door and held his breath. The voices from the sitting room drifted through the house with the lazy quality of a summer afternoon. But there was something sharp underneath Uncle Vernon's usual bluster that made Harry's stomach clench with familiar dread. "Department of Magical Law Enforcement, they called it," Uncle Vernon was saying, his voice pitched lower than usual. "Sounds like complete rubbish to me. But Marge's neighbour swears his sister works there. Government office in London, handles complaints about—" The voice dropped even further, and Harry pressed closer to the door, splinters catching on his too large t-shirt. "Keep your voice down," Aunt Petunia hissed. "The boy is locked in his cupboard where he belongs," Uncle Vernon snapped, "and he'll stay there until he learns not to embarrass us in front of the Polkises." Harry's cheek throbbed where Aunt Petunia had struck him that morning for dropping Dudley's breakfast plate. It had been an accident. His hands had been shaking from hunger. But accidents didn't matter in this house. Nothing mattered except keeping the neighbors from asking questions and making sure Dudley never wanted for anything. The conversation moved on to other things, but those words stuck in Harry's mind like honey on fingers. Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It sounded important, official, like the police, but different. Like the kind of place where someone might listen if a 9-year-old boy had something terrible to tell them. Harry slumped back against the far wall of his cupboard, drawing his knees up to his chest. The space was barely large enough for him to lie down straight, and it smelled perpetually of cleaning supplies and dust. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, controlled by a switch outside his door. Right now, the Dursleys had left him in darkness. He could hear Dudley's heavy footsteps thumping up the stairs to his second bedroom, the one filled with broken toys and discarded presents, while Harry remained trapped in a space smaller than most people's closets. His stomach gave an angry growl that he tried to muffle with his sleeve. There had been no lunch today, and probably wouldn't be dinner either. This was his life. This had always been his life, for as long as he could remember. The cupboard, the hunger, the casual cruelty that the Dursleys dealt out, like other families dealt out hugs and bedtime stories. They told him his parents had been drunks who died in a car crash, that he was lucky the Dursleys had taken him in at all, that he was nothing but a burden and a freak who should be grateful for the roof over his head. But Harry had been thinking, lately, about whether this was really how other children lived. Whether other 9-year-olds slept in cupboards and went to bed hungry, and wore clothes that hung off them like sacks. He didn't think they did. He'd seen enough at school, in the brief moments between Dudley's gang chasing him and the teachers looking the other way, to know that something was wrong with his life. The problem was that no one seemed to care. The school certainly didn't. Mrs. Henderson had asked about his bruises once, early on, and Uncle Vernon had smoothly explained about Harry's clumsiness, his tendency to pick fights with bigger boys, his unfortunate habit of walking into doors. After that, the teachers had stopped asking questions. They didn't want to know. But maybe this department place would be different. Maybe government people had to listen. Maybe they had rules about how children were supposed to be treated. Harry felt around in the darkness until his fingers found the small cache of supplies he kept hidden behind a loose board. A stubby pencil he'd rescued from the bin at school, some sheets of paper he'd carefully torn from old notebooks, and a torch with a dying battery that he used only for the most important things. This felt important. He clicked on the torch and positioned the paper on his knees, squinting in the weak yellow light. Then he began to write, his 9-year-old handwriting careful and laborious. To whoever handles bad things at the ministry, my name is Harry Potter, and I live at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. I am writing to you because I think someone should know what happens in this house. Harry paused, chewing the end of his pencil. How did you explain a lifetime of small cruelties and deliberate neglect? How did you make someone understand that every day was a careful navigation between Uncle Vernon's temper and Aunt Petunia's cold indifference and Dudley's casual violence? I sleep in the cupboard under the stairs. I have always slept here since I was very small. My cousin Dudley has 2 bedrooms and I have none. When I ask why, Uncle Vernon tells me I should be grateful to have a roof over my head at all. The words came slowly at first, then faster as 9 years of stored grievances found their way onto paper. Harry wrote about the meals he missed, about wearing Dudley's cast-off clothes that were 4 sizes too large, about the times Uncle Vernon had grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against the wall for breaking something, or talking back, or simply existing in the same space. He wrote about Aunt Petunia's sharp fingernails digging into his arm when she dragged him to his cupboard, about the way she smiled when she told him his parents had been worthless drunks who deserved to die. He wrote about Dudley's games, Harry hunting, they called it at school, and how Uncle Vernon had laughed when Dudley came home with stories about cornering Harry behind the bike sheds. Sometimes strange things happen around me, Harry wrote, his pencil moving more slowly now. Things I can't explain. Glass breaks when I'm angry, or my hair grows back overnight after Aunt Petunia cuts it short. Uncle Vernon says these things prove I'm a freak, that I'm not normal, that I deserve everything that happens to me. I don't know why these things happen. I just know that when they do, the Dursleys get angrier. The torch flickered and dimmed, but Harry kept writing, page after page, filled with careful, childish script, as he documented every small cruelty, every deliberate humiliation, every time the Dursleys had reminded him that he was unwanted and unloved, and would never be anything more than a burden to be endured. I don't think other children live like this, he wrote near the end of what had become his 14th page. I see them at school with their packed lunches and their clean clothes, and their parents who come to collect them. I see Dudley with his room full of toys, and his friends and his birthday parties, where he gets 37 presents just because he wants them. I have never had a birthday party. I have never had a present that was meant for me, and not a hand-me-down from Dudley. I have never had anyone tell me they love me, or that I matter, or that they're glad I exist. I don't know if you can help me. I don't even know if you'll read this. But I thought someone should know. I thought there should be a record, somewhere, that Harry Potter lived in this house, and that he was not treated the way a child should be treated. If there are rules about how children are supposed to live, then the Dursleys have broken all of them. If there are laws about these things, then they have broken those too. Please help me. I don't know where else to turn. Harry Potter, age 9. 4 Privet Drive. Little Whinging, Surrey. Harry set down his pencil and rubbed his cramped fingers. The torch had nearly died, casting everything in a sickly amber glow that made the cupboard feel even smaller than usual. Outside, he could hear the Dursleys settling in for their evening television programs, their voices a comfortable murmur of domestic contentment that had never included him. He folded the pages carefully, all 14 of them, and tucked them into his pocket. Tomorrow, somehow, he would find a way to get this letter to London. He would find a post office and an envelope and stamps, and he would send his story out into the world like a message in a bottle. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe the Department of Magical Law Enforcement was just another government office full of people who didn't want to know about inconvenient children with inconvenient problems. But maybe, just maybe, someone would read his letter and decide that 9-year-old boys shouldn't sleep in cupboards. Maybe someone would care. Harry clicked off the torch and curled up on his thin mattress, the letter burning like a secret against his chest. For the first time in years, he fell asleep with something that might have been hope. Harry woke before dawn with the letter still pressed against his ribs where he'd hidden it beneath his too large shirt. The cupboard was black as pitch, but he could feel the folded pages crackling softly with each breath, like a promise he'd made to himself in the darkness. 3 days had passed since he'd finished writing, 3 days of carrying those 14 pages everywhere and waiting for the right moment. The Dursleys had kept him locked in the cupboard for most of it, punishment for existing, as far as Harry could tell. But today was Saturday, and Saturdays meant errands. Aunt Petunia would need to go to the shops, and she'd drag Dudley along to help carry bags. Uncle Vernon would settle in front of the television with his newspaper and his tea, and for perhaps an hour, Harry might find himself alone. The house began to stir around him. Footsteps thumped overhead as Dudley rolled out of bed, followed by Aunt Petunia's sharp voice telling him to hurry up or they'd miss the early sales. Harry pressed his ear to the door and listened to the familiar choreography of Saturday morning. Dudley's whining about having to come shopping, Uncle Vernon's grunt of dismissal, Aunt Petunia's heels clicking efficiently across the kitchen tiles. "The boy stays locked up," Uncle Vernon's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "No breakfast today either, not after yesterday's cheek." Harry hadn't given any cheek yesterday. He'd simply asked if he could have some of the toast Dudley had left on his plate, and Uncle Vernon had backhanded him across the face, hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises along his jaw. But it didn't matter what had actually happened. In this house, Harry was always guilty of something. "He'll be fine for a few hours," Aunt Petunia replied, with the casual indifference she reserved for discussing furniture or the weather. "Perhaps it will teach him not to be so greedy." The front door slammed, followed by the sound of the car starting. Harry waited, counting his heartbeats, until he heard Uncle Vernon's chair creak as he settled into it for his morning routine. Then he felt carefully along the bottom edge of his cupboard door until his fingers found the loose board he'd discovered years ago. The lock on his cupboard door was simple, a basic sliding bolt that could be reached through the gap if you knew exactly where to push. It had taken Harry months to work out the right angle, and he only used this knowledge in the direst emergencies. Being caught outside his cupboard when he was supposed to be locked in would earn him a beating that would leave him unable to walk for days. But the letter was more important than his safety. It had to be. Harry held his breath and worked the bolt free, then eased the door open just wide enough to slip through. The house felt enormous after the confines of his cupboard, all high ceilings and proper rooms with windows that let in natural light. He could hear Uncle Vernon's snores drifting from the sitting room, already asleep in his chair, despite it being barely 8 in the morning. Moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned that being noticed meant being hurt, Harry crept toward the kitchen. He needed an envelope and stamps, and some way to figure out how to address a letter to a government department he'd only heard mentioned in passing. The kitchen drawers yielded a brown envelope, slightly creased but serviceable. Harry smoothed it out on the counter and carefully folded his 14 pages until they fit inside. Then came the harder part, the address. He found a biro in the junk drawer and stared at the blank envelope for a long moment. He'd never posted a letter before. The Dursleys certainly weren't going to teach him, and it had never come up at school. But he'd seen Uncle Vernon writing addresses often enough. Name first, then the place, then the town. In his careful 9-year-old handwriting, Harry wrote, "To whoever handles bad things at the Ministry Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Ministry of Magic, London." It looked official enough, he thought. London was a big place, but surely postmen knew where government offices were. That was their job, wasn't it? The stamps were harder. Harry knew they cost money, and he had none. But as he rifled through the kitchen drawers, looking for anything that might help, his fingers found a small pile of stamps tucked behind Aunt Petunia's shopping lists. She must have bought them for posting bills and forgotten about them. Harry took 2 stamps, surely 2 would be enough to get a letter to London, and stuck them carefully to the envelope. The whole thing looked very official now, very important, like the kind of letter that would demand attention from serious government people. Now came the hardest part: actually posting it. The nearest post box was 3 streets away, past the Pulkises' house and around the corner by the primary school. Harry had walked past it hundreds of times, but had never really paid attention to the collection times posted on the front. He would have to hope for the best. Uncle Vernon's snores continued to rumble from the sitting room as Harry slipped toward the front door. He turned the handle with infinite care, wincing at every tiny creak, and stepped out into the morning sunshine. Little Whinging was quiet at this hour, most families still finishing their Saturday breakfasts or sleeping in. Harry had never been out alone before. The Dursleys didn't trust him not to tell tales to the neighbours, and the freedom felt strange and dangerous. Every step away from Privet Drive was a step deeper into trouble, but he forced himself to keep walking. The post box stood red and solid on the corner, its mouth gaping like a hungry creature waiting to be fed. Harry had expected to feel nervous, but instead he felt oddly calm as he approached it. This was the right thing to do. Maybe the only thing he could do. He kissed the envelope gently, a gesture that surprised him with its tenderness, and slipped it through the slot. It disappeared into the darkness with a soft thud, and Harry felt something inside his chest ease for the first time in years. It was done. His story was out in the world now, travelling toward London and whatever government people did with letters from 9-year-old boys. Maybe they would read it and shake their heads sadly and file it away with a dozen others. Maybe they would decide it was too much trouble to investigate. But maybe, just maybe, someone would care. Harry walked home more slowly than he'd walked away, savouring these few minutes of freedom before he had to lock himself back in his cupboard and pretend he'd never left. The morning air smelled of cut grass and roses from the neighbours' gardens, scents that never penetrated the stale confines of his cupboard. Birds sang in the trees lining the street, and somewhere a dog barked happily as children played in their back garden. This was the world other children lived in, he thought, the world of Saturday mornings and breakfast with families and pets that loved you, the world of bedrooms with windows and toys that belonged to you, and clothes that fit properly. He'd written about all of this in his letter. Not just the bad things the Dursleys did, but the good things he'd never had. I have never owned a toy that was new, he'd written. Everything I have ever touched belonged to Dudley first, and by the time I get it, it's usually broken. I watch him open presents at Christmas, 37 last year, I counted, and I know that I will never have a Christmas morning like that. I will never have anyone excited to give me something special. I have never had a friend come for tea. I have never been invited to a birthday party. I have never had anyone call me by a nickname, or ruffle my hair affectionately, or tell me they're proud of me. I sleep in a cupboard, and sometimes I dream about having a real room with a proper bed and a window, and maybe a bookshelf. In my dreams, the room has yellow walls, and there's always warm light coming through the curtains. When I wake up and remember where I am, it hurts worse than any of Uncle Vernon's beatings. Harry slipped back into the house and locked himself in his cupboard just as Uncle Vernon began to stir in his chair. His heart was still racing from the adventure, but underneath the fear was something else. Satisfaction. For the first time in his life, He had done something that was entirely his own choice. The Dursleys could lock him up and starve him and tell him he was worthless, but they couldn't take back what he'd just done. His letter was gone, carrying with it every secret this house had tried to keep. Miles away, in the bowels of a building that Muggles walked past every day without seeing, an automated sorting charm detected the words Ministry of Magic, written in a child's careful handwriting. The letter vanished from the Royal Mail sorting office with a small pop and reappeared in a basket marked External Communications on the second floor of a gleaming tower that existed in the spaces between the mundane world. A junior clerk picked it up during his morning rounds and frowned at the address. Letters from children weren't uncommon. The ministry received dozens every year from young witches and wizards asking questions about their Hogwarts letters or complaining about unfair detentions. But this letter was different. This letter had been posted through Muggle channels, and the handwriting was too young, too careful, too desperate. The clerk opened the envelope and read the first page, then the second. By the third page, his hands were shaking. By the 14th, he was reaching for his wand to call his supervisor. In a cupboard on Privet Drive, Harry Potter curled up on his thin mattress and smiled. For the first time in 9 years, he had hope. Senior Investigator Thorne had been working child protection cases for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, she had never received a letter quite like this one. She sat at her desk on level 2 of the Ministry building, surrounded by the familiar chaos of the DMLE, the constant shuffle of interdepartmental memos swooping overhead, the murmur of auras discussing case files, the occasional crack of apparition as field investigators returned from their assignments. It was Tuesday morning, and she'd expected to spend it reviewing routine complaints about underage magic and filing reports on monitoring charm violations. Instead, she found herself staring at 14 pages of careful, childish handwriting that made her stomach turn cold with recognition. My name is Harry Potter, and I live at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Harry Potter. Even 9 years after you-know-who's defeat, that name carried weight throughout the ministry. The boy who lived, the child who had somehow survived the killing curse and brought down the most dangerous dark wizard in a century. Ministry officials spoke of him in hushed tones when they spoke of him at all, and most assumed he was living a life of comfort and safety, somewhere far from the public eye. Thorne had assumed the same thing. Everyone had. She read the letter again, more slowly this time, her trained investigator's mind cataloguing each allegation with growing horror. Forced to sleep in a cupboard, deliberately starved, beaten for minor infractions or sometimes for no reason at all. Told repeatedly that he was unwanted, unloved, a burden to be endured. I don't think other children live like this, the boy had written in his careful 9-year-old script. I see them at school with their packed lunches and their clean clothes and their parents who come to collect them. Thorne set down the letter and rubbed her temples. In 15 years of child protection work, she had seen neglect and abuse in all its forms, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about this letter. Perhaps it was the careful politeness of it, the way the child apologized for taking up their time and asked so hesitantly for help, or perhaps it was the fact that Harry Potter, had been failed so completely by the very people entrusted with his safety. She reached for her copy of Magical Child Protection, Legal Frameworks and Procedures, and flipped to the chapter on guardianship cases involving Muggle families. The legal framework around magical Muggle interactions was complex at the best of times, layered with centuries of statute of secrecy considerations and jurisdictional complications. When a magical child was placed with non-magical guardians, the situation became exponentially more complicated. The Muggle authorities had no jurisdiction over magical children, that much was clear. But the magical authorities had limited powers of intervention in Muggle households, particularly when those households were supposed to be providing protection under specific magical conditions. Thorne frowned as she read through the relevant statutes. There were provisions for emergency removal of magical children from dangerous situations, but they required either imminent threat of death or documented evidence of severe physical abuse. Emotional neglect and non-life-threatening physical punishments fell into a legal grey area that had never been adequately addressed by the Wizengamot. More problematically, any intervention would require careful consideration of the circumstances surrounding Harry Potter's placement. Thorne didn't have access to those files. They would be sealed at the highest levels of ministry security. But she knew enough about the case to understand that the boy hadn't been placed with his relatives arbitrarily. There had been protections involved, ancient magic that required specific conditions to maintain. She stood and walked to her filing cabinet, extracting a thick folder labeled Guardianship Protocols, Special Circumstances. The protocols for children under protective enchantments were arcane and rarely invoked, but they existed. And they all stressed the same thing. Any change to a protected child's living arrangements required extensive consultation with the original architects of the protection. In Harry Potter's case, that meant Albus Dumbledore. Thorne returned to her desk and read through the letter once more, this time taking notes on each allegation: forced confinement in inadequate sleeping arrangements, deliberate withholding of food as punishment, physical violence described in terms suggesting it was routine rather than exceptional, systematic emotional abuse designed to make the child believe he deserved maltreatment. Any one of these allegations would warrant investigation. Together, they painted a picture of systematic abuse that made Thorne's professional objectivity waver towards something much more personal and angry. She pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began drafting her initial report. Case file. Potter, Harry James. Complainant. Self-reported via external correspondence. Nature of allegations. Multiple violations of basic child welfare standards. Initial assessment, credible and urgent. Summary. Subject has self-reported systematic pattern of abuse and neglect by guardians, Vernon and Petunia Dursley, of 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Allegations include forced confinement in inadequate living space, deliberate food deprivation, routine physical violence, and systematic emotional abuse. Subject's age, 9 years, and circumstances of guardianship placement require immediate consultation with relevant authorities. Legal considerations. Case complicated by subject's status as protected person under special magical protections. Any intervention must consider potential disruption to existing protective enchantments. Recommend immediate consultation with Chief Warlock of Wizengamot and review of original placement documentation. Recommended actions. 1. Immediate welfare check at reported address. 2. Consultation with placement authorities. 3. Review of legal options within existing Muggle magical jurisdictional framework. 4. Assessment of alternative placement options should removal become necessary. Thorne set down her quill and stared at the report. In her 15 years with the DMLE, she had never had to write a case summary involving the boy who lived. She had never had to contemplate removing a protected child from guardians specifically chosen by Albus Dumbledore. She had never had to navigate the intersection of child welfare law and ancient protective magic. But she had also never read a letter quite so clear in its desperation or so careful in its documentation of systematic cruelty. She stood and walked to the window that overlooked Diagon Alley. Below, wizarding families moved through their daily routines, parents shopping with children, couples sharing tea at cafe tables, elderly witches feeding crumbs to the occasional owl that swooped down from the rooftops. It was a world Harry Potter had saved, but had never been permitted to see. A community that owed him everything, but had somehow failed to notice his suffering. The letter lay on her desk behind her, 14 pages of careful accusations that would need to be investigated with all the thoroughness the DMLE could muster. But underneath the professional obligation lay something more personal. The recognition that a child had reached out for help in the only way he knew how, and that child happened to be the most important magical person of their generation. Thorne returned to her desk and reached for the speaking tube that connected her office to the Aura headquarters down the hall. This case would require resources, and it would require discretion, and it would require careful navigation of political and magical complexities that made her head spin just thinking about them. But first, it required someone to acknowledge what Harry Potter had been brave enough to put into words, that no child, magical or otherwise, famous or unknown, should have to live the way he had described. "Aura Dawson," came the voice through the speaking tube. "This is Senior Investigator Thorne. I need to speak with you about a case that's just come in. High priority, high sensitivity. Can you come to my office?" "On my way." Thorne set the tube back in its cradle and began gathering the letter and her preliminary report. Within the hour, this case would be working its way up the DMLE hierarchy, drawing attention from supervisors and department heads, and eventually, inevitably, from the very people who had made Harry Potter's placement decisions in the first place. She only hoped they would act with the urgency the situation demanded, because somewhere in Little Whinging, a 9-year-old boy was locked in a cupboard, waiting to see if anyone cared enough to help him. And for the first time in 9 years, someone finally did. The silver instruments in Albus Dumbledore's office had been humming with unusual agitation all morning, their delicate mechanisms responding to currents of magic that spoke of significant events unfolding beyond the castle walls. Dumbledore himself sat behind his desk, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching Fawkes preen his magnificent red and gold feathers in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. It was a peaceful scene, or would have been, if not for the formal ministry parchment that lay before him, bearing the seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Request for consultation regarding protected minor Harry Potter. The letter began in the crisp, official language of bureaucracy. Allegations of guardian misconduct received. Your immediate attention required as Chief Warlock and Original Placement Authority. Dumbledore had read the letter 3 times since it arrived by Ministry Owl an hour ago, and each reading had done nothing to diminish the cold weight that had settled in his chest. He had known this day might come, had feared it if he was entirely honest with himself, but he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that love might grow where blood had commanded it. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come," he called, and the office door opened to admit Minerva McGonagall, her expression already tight with the particular brand of concern that meant she had heard whispers from her contacts within the ministry. "Albus," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. "I've just received a most disturbing owl from Agnes Clearwater in the DMLE. She tells me there's an investigation beginning into Harry Potter's living arrangements." Dumbledore gestured to the parchment before him. "I have received a similar communication. It appears young Harry has written to the ministry himself, detailing his treatment at the hands of his aunt and uncle." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken tension. McGonagall's lips pressed into a thin line, and her dark eyes flashed with something that might have been vindication or might have been regret. "He wrote to them himself," she repeated slowly. A 9-year-old child felt the need to appeal to the government for protection from his own guardians. So it would seem. "Albus," McGonagall leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone she used when addressing particularly thick-headed students. "Do you remember what I told you that night? November 1st, 1981? Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually bright with their characteristic twinkle, had gone grave. "You expressed concerns about the suitability of the Dursley family as guardians." "I said they were the worst sort of muggles," McGonagall corrected sharply. "I watched them for an entire day. Albus. I saw Vernon Dursley kick a cat. I watched Petunia Dursley peer through her curtains at the neighbours with the expression of someone cataloguing their failures. I saw Dudley Dursley, a toddler then, throw a tantrum so spectacular that it left his mother in tears and his father threatening to wallop him. And you left Harry with them anyway." The words hung in the air between them, charged with 8 years of suppressed disagreement. Dumbledore removed his half-moon spectacles and began cleaning them with careful, deliberate movements. "The blood protection—" "Don't!" McGonagall's voice cut across his like a blade. "Don't speak to me about blood protection until you can look me in the eye and tell me it was worth this. Whatever Harry has written in that letter, whatever has driven a 9-year-old child to beg strangers for help, was your magical protection worth that?" Dumbledore replaced his spectacles and met her gaze steadily. The weight of leadership had always been heavy, but never more so than in moments like this, when the choices that had seemed necessary in the dark of war were exposed to the harsh light of peacetime scrutiny. "The protection is real, Minerva," he said quietly. "Lily's sacrifice created a ward more powerful than any I could have cast, any the Ministry could have provided. As long as Harry can call the place where his mother's sister lives home, he cannot be touched by Voldemort's followers. The blood ties, the bonds of family, however strained, are what anchor that protection. And if those bonds are built on fear and resentment rather than love?" McGonagall asked. "What manner of protection is that?" It was the question that had haunted Dumbledore's quietest moments for 8 years, the doubt that crept in during the long hours before dawn, when even the most confident leader must confront the full weight of his decisions. He had gambled with Harry Potter's childhood, staked it against the promise of magical protection and the hope that love might bloom where none existed. "I believed," he said slowly, "that the protection would hold regardless, that blood shared would be enough, even if affection was absent. And if you were wrong?" Dumbledore stood and moved to the window that overlooked the grounds of Hogwarts. Below, the summer air shimmered with heat and possibility, and he could see students from the few families who remained at school over the holidays playing by the lake's edge. Children who knew themselves to be loved, who had grown up secure in their place in the world, who would come to him for guidance rather than writing desperate letters to government ministries. "If I was wrong," he said at last, "then I have committed a grave error indeed." McGonagall joined him at the window, her presence both comforting and challenging in the way of old friendships, tested by fundamental disagreement. "The DMLE will want answers, Albus. They'll want to know why you placed a magical child with muggles who were demonstrably unsuited for the task. They'll want to know whether the protection you've built is worth preserving at the cost of Harry's welfare." "I know. And what will you tell them?" Dumbledore turned from the window to meet her eyes. In them, he saw not the anger he might have expected, but something far more difficult to bear: disappointment. Minerva McGonagall had followed him through war and peace, had trusted his judgment in matters great and small, and now she was asking him to explain how he had failed a child they both had sworn to protect. "I will tell them the truth," he said, "that I chose to prioritize Harry's physical safety over his emotional well-being, that I believed the threat from Voldemort's followers was greater than any harm his relatives might cause him, that I thought a childhood of mere unhappiness was an acceptable price for ensuring he lived to have an adulthood at all. And do you still believe that?" The question hung between them like a pensive memory, demanding honesty, even when honesty was painful. Dumbledore considered the 9-year-old boy who had felt so desperate that he had written to strangers for help, the child who would arrive at Hogwarts in 2 years, carrying whatever emotional scars his guardians had inflicted. "I believed it was a choice between physical safety and emotional comfort," he admitted. "It appears I may have underestimated how severe the latter would be." McGonagall's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "The boy deserves better than our underestimations, Albus. He deserves adults who put his welfare above their theories about magical protection." "Yes," Dumbledore agreed quietly. "He does." They stood together in silence for a moment, 2 educators contemplating their failure to protect the most vulnerable child in their care. Outside, the afternoon shadows were lengthening, and somewhere in London, ministry officials were beginning an investigation that would force them all to confront the true cost of the choices made in war's dark aftermath. "The DMLE will want to remove him from the Dursleys," McGonagall said at last. "Very likely. And the protection?" Dumbledore returned to his desk and picked up the ministry letter, reading once more the formal language that spoke of allegations and investigations and consultations. When he looked up, his blue eyes held a weariness that made him appear every one of his 108 years. "The protection may not survive his removal from Petunia's care," he said. "The magic that shields him depends on the bonds of blood and family, however strained they may be. If those bonds are severed, then we find other ways to protect him," McGonagall said firmly. "We surround him with people who will love him as well as guard him. We give him the childhood he should have had from the beginning." Dumbledore nodded slowly. It would mean acknowledging his error, accepting that his grand design for Harry Potter's protection had caused more harm than it prevented. It would mean facing the questions of ministry investigators and the judgment of colleagues who had trusted his wisdom. It would mean admitting that the brilliant plan he had constructed in the wake of Lily and James's death had been built on flawed assumptions about the nature of family and love. But perhaps, he thought, as he reached for his quill to begin drafting his response to the DMLE, it was past time for such admissions. Perhaps the boy who had survived the killing curse deserved better than survival alone. Professor Minerva McGonagall stood at her office window, watching the sun set over the Hogwarts grounds, but her mind was 8 years away, fixed on a cold November morning that had haunted her dreams more nights than she cared to count. November 1st, 1981. The day they had placed Harry Potter with the Dursleys. She pressed her fingers against the cool glass and let the memories wash over her with their familiar weight of regret. She had been younger then, 46, and still believing that expressing concern was enough, that stating one's objections for the record was sufficient to clear one's conscience. She had learned better in the years since, but the knowledge had come far too late to help the child who needed it most. "I should have done more," she thought, the same accusation that had followed her through 8 years of sleepless nights. I should have refused to leave him there. The irony was bitter. She had spent that entire day watching the Dursleys, cataloguing their failures, documenting their unsuitability with the thoroughness of someone building a case. And then she had done nothing with that case except present it to Albus Dumbledore, who had dismissed her concerns with talk of blood protection and greater goods. McGonagall moved to her desk and sank into her chair, her square spectacles reflecting the dying light. The memories were as clear as if they had happened yesterday. The tabby cat perched on a garden wall in Privet Drive, watching Vernon Dursley kick a stray cat with casual cruelty, while his wife peered through the curtains at their neighbours with the sharp-eyed malice of someone who collected grievances like other people collected stamps. She had watched little Dudley Dursley, barely more than a toddler then, throw such a spectacular tantrum over a broken toy that his father had threatened to wallop him, while his mother dissolved into tears of frustration. The child had been spoiled beyond bearing, even at that young age, demanding and receiving instant gratification for every whim. And into that household they had placed Harry Potter. McGonagall removed her spectacles and rubbed her tired eyes. She could still remember the weight of the baby in her arms when Hagrid had handed him down from his flying motorbike, the way Harry's small fist had curled around her finger with perfect trust. He had been so small, so completely vulnerable, and she had known that the Dursleys would never love him as he deserved. But she had also known that Albus Dumbledore was the wisest wizard of their age, that his decisions had saved them all from Voldemort's darkness, that questioning his judgment felt like questioning the very foundations of everything she believed about right and wrong. So she had voiced her concerns, and then stepped aside, trusting that wisdom would prevail over her instincts. What a fool I was. The letter from the ministry lay on her desk, where she had placed it after leaving Dumbledore's office, its official seals and formal language a stark reminder of how completely they had all failed Harry Potter. A 9-year-old child had felt compelled to write to government strangers because the adults responsible for his welfare had failed him so utterly. McGonagall stood and began pacing the length of her office, her footsteps sharp against the stone floor. She had taught thousands of children in her decades at Hogwarts, had seen them arrive as frightened first years and leave as confident young adults ready to take their place in the wizarding world. She prided herself on recognizing the signs of neglect or abuse, on creating a safe haven for students who came from difficult homes. But Harry Potter wouldn't arrive at Hogwarts for another 2 years, and by then, how much damage would have been done? How much of his spirit would have been crushed under the weight of systematic cruelty and deliberate neglect? She paused at her bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spine of transfiguration for advanced students without seeing it. In her mind, she could hear her own voice from that November morning, crisp with disapproval, as she confronted Dumbledore on Privet Drive. These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. And Dumbledore had replied with gentle certainty that it would be better for Harry to grow up away from all that, to have a normal childhood free from the burden of fame, a normal childhood. McGonagall's hands clenched into fists at the memory. What was normal about sleeping in a cupboard? What was normal about being denied food and affection and basic human decency? She had been so focused on the abstract concern of fame that she had failed to address the concrete reality of cruelty. She had worried about Harry Potter the symbol while ignoring Harry Potter the child, and now he's written to the ministry for help. The thought cut through her like a blade. A 9-year-old boy, desperate enough to risk punishment for reaching out to strangers, brave enough to document his own suffering in careful, childish handwriting. While she had spent 8 years teaching transfiguration and managing house points and pretending that her concerns had been properly addressed, Harry Potter had been learning that the adults in his life could not be trusted to protect him. McGonagall returned to her desk and picked up the ministry letter, reading once more the formal request for consultation about allegations of guardian misconduct. Between the lines, she could read the real message. You failed him. All of you failed him. And now it falls to us to clean up the mess you made. She had failed him. That was the truth she had been avoiding for 8 years. The reality that made her stomach clench with shame every time she remembered that November morning. She had seen the signs, documented the evidence, presented her case, and then she had walked away when her concerns were dismissed. A true protector would have done more. A true protector would have found another way. McGonagall thought of the students currently sleeping in Gryffindor Tower, children she would defend with her life if necessary. If any of them came to her with tales of abuse and neglect, she would move heaven and earth to ensure their safety. She would not be satisfied with expressing concerns to authority figures. She would act. Why had she not offered the same fierce protection to Harry Potter? Because he was not her student then. Because Dumbledore's authority was absolute. Because the war had just ended, and everyone was still learning how to live in a world without constant threat of death. The excuses felt hollow in her mind, inadequate justification for 8 years of a child suffering. McGonagall stood and walked to the portrait of the previous Transfiguration professor that hung beside her desk. The painted figure was asleep, but she spoke to it anyway, her voice barely above a whisper. I let fear of challenging authority override my duty to protect a child, she said. I chose institutional loyalty over moral courage, and now Harry Potter has paid the price for my cowardice. The portrait stirred but did not wake, leaving McGonagall alone with her confession and the weight of 8 years' worth of regret. She thought of Harry as she had last seen him, a baby sleeping peacefully in Dumbledore's arms, trusting completely in the adults who surrounded him. That trust had been betrayed, systematically and thoroughly, by every person who had the power to help him and chose not to act. But it's not too late, she told herself firmly. The investigation is beginning. There's still time to do right by him. McGonagall returned to her desk and pulled out a fresh piece of parchment. If the ministry wanted consultation about Harry Potter's case, they would have it, but not the careful, measured response they were probably expecting from a deputy headmistress concerned about institutional reputation. They would have the truth. All of it. She dipped her quill in ink and began to write. To whom it may concern. I am writing in response to your inquiry regarding Harry Potter and the circumstances of his placement with Vernon and Petunia Dursley in 1981. I feel it is important that you understand the full context of the decisions made that night, including the concerns that were raised and subsequently ignored. I observed the Dursley family for an entire day on November 1st, 1981, and found them to be, in my professional assessment, completely unsuitable as guardians for any child, much less one as significant as Harry Potter. My specific observations included. McGonagall wrote steadily as the last of the daylight faded outside her window, documenting every detail she could remember from that long-ago November day. Every cruelty she had witnessed, every red flag she had noted, every reason she had given for opposing the placement. Most importantly, she wrote about her own failure to act when her concerns were dismissed. She would not hide behind the excuse of institutional hierarchy or the complexity of wartime decisions. She had failed to protect a child in her care, and she would say so clearly and without reservation. When the ministry investigators came to Hogwarts and she had no doubt they would come. They would find in her an ally, not an obstacle. Harry Potter deserved advocates who put his welfare above their own comfort, above their loyalty to institutions and colleagues, and the convenient fiction that expressing concern was enough. He deserved what she should have given him 8 years ago, someone willing to fight for him, no matter the cost. McGonagall signed her name with a firm hand and sealed the letter with her personal crest. Tomorrow, she would send it to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Tonight, she would begin planning what she should have planned in 1981. How to ensure that Harry Potter finally received the protection and care that every child deserved. It was 8 years too late, but it was not too late to begin trying to make amends. The unmarked ministry van pulled to a stop 3 houses down from 4 Privet Drive at precisely 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, positioning itself with the practiced discretion of investigators who understood that successful surveillance required invisibility. Senior investigator Hendricks adjusted the "Notice Me Not" charm on the vehicle and checked her equipment one final time, while her partner consulted a detailed street map of Little Whinging. "Muggle-repelling wards are in place," Investigator Walsh reported quietly, his wand trained on the van's windows. "We can observe without interference, but we'll need to be careful about magical signatures. This is a heavily Muggle area." Hendricks nodded, her trained eye already cataloguing the pristine suburban street with its identical houses and manicured lawns. Privet Drive looked exactly like what it was, a place where conformity was valued above all else, where anything unusual would be noticed immediately and reported to the proper authorities. It was, she reflected grimly, perhaps the worst possible environment for a magical child. "Target residence is the 2-story house with the green door," she said, consulting her notes. "Vernon Dursley, employed at Grunning's Drill Company. Petunia Dursley, housewife. 1 child, Dudley, age 9. And our subject, Harry Potter, also 9, placed with the family as an infant in 1981. Walsh raised his omnioculars and focused them on number 4. The magical instruments would allow them to see through walls and observe the household's activities without detection, but they required careful calibration to avoid triggering any protective wards that might be in place around Harry Potter. "I've got visual confirmation of the layout," Walsh reported after several minutes of careful observation. "Standard 2-story configuration, 3 bedrooms upstairs, sitting room and kitchen downstairs, and—" He paused, adjusting the focus with a frown. "There's something odd about the space under the stairs." Hendricks felt her stomach clench. The boy's letter had mentioned sleeping in a cupboard, but seeing it confirmed through magical surveillance made the reality somehow more stark. "What are you seeing?" "There's a small space under the staircase that's been converted into some kind of sleeping area. Mattress on the floor, no window, barely large enough for a child to lie down. And there are locks on the outside of the door." The investigators exchanged a grim look. In 15 years of child protection work, Hendricks had seen many forms of neglect and abuse, but forcing a child to sleep in a cupboard while providing proper bedrooms for other family members spoke to a level of deliberate cruelty that made her professional detachment difficult to maintain. "Any sign of the children?" she asked. Walsh adjusted the omnioculars again, scanning the house methodically. "The larger child, Dudley presumably, is in the kitchen with the adult female. She's preparing breakfast. Multiple plates, but—" He paused, counting carefully. "Only 3 place settings. The adult male appears to be getting ready for work upstairs. And Harry Potter? No visual confirmation yet. The cupboard door appears to be closed and locked from the outside." Hendricks made careful notes in her case file, documenting everything they observed with the precision that would be required if this case went before the Wizengamot. The complex legal framework around magical Muggle interactions meant that every piece of evidence needed to be gathered according to strict protocols, with particular attention paid to maintaining the statute of secrecy while ensuring the child's welfare. "We'll need to establish a pattern of behavior," she said. The letter alleged systematic abuse, but we need to document it ourselves. Ministry regulations require direct observation of living conditions and treatment patterns before we can recommend intervention. They waited and watched as the morning unfolded in the Dursley household. Vernon Dursley left for work at 7:30, barely acknowledging his wife and son as he departed. Petunia Dursley finished preparing breakfast and called Dudley to the table, where the boy proceeded to consume what appeared to be enough food for 3 people, while his mother fussed over him with obvious affection. At no point did either adult make any move to check on Harry Potter or provide him with food. "It's been over 12 hours since yesterday's evening meal," Walsh observed, consulting the timeline they had been building. "If the boy is locked in that cupboard, he hasn't eaten since yesterday afternoon." Hendrix felt her jaw tighten. Deliberate food deprivation as punishment was a serious form of abuse, particularly when applied to a growing child. Combined with the inadequate sleeping arrangements, it painted a picture of systematic neglect that went far beyond the occasional harsh word or missed meal. "There," Walsh said suddenly. "Movement in the cupboard." Hendrix raised her own omnioculars and focused on the space under the stairs. Through the magical lenses, she could see a small figure stirring on the thin mattress, a boy with untidy black hair and clothes that hung off his thin frame like sacks. Even through the walls and magical observation, she could see that Harry Potter was significantly smaller and thinner than his cousin, despite being only weeks younger. They watched as the boy sat up carefully in the cramped space, pressing his ear to the cupboard door as if listening for sounds from the rest of the house. His movements were cautious, practiced, the behavior of a child who had learned to gauge the moods of adults before making himself known. "He's been trained to wait for permission before coming out," Hendrix observed quietly. "Look at how he's listening, testing whether it's safe. That's not normal child behavior." Walsh nodded grimly. The letter mentioned being locked in as punishment. This appears to confirm that the confinement is routine rather than exceptional. They continued their surveillance as the morning progressed, documenting each interaction and cataloguing the evidence with growing concern. Dudley Dursley received his mother's full attention. Second helpings at breakfast, assistance with getting dressed, casual affection expressed through hair ruffling and casual touches. Harry Potter remained locked in his cupboard until nearly 10 o'clock, when Petunia Dursley finally opened the door and commanded him to clean the kitchen. The investigators watched as the 9-year-old boy emerged from his prison, blinking in the normal light like someone emerging from a cave. His movements were quick and efficient as he began washing the breakfast dishes that the family had left for him to clean, but Hendrix noticed the way he glanced constantly at his aunt, monitoring her mood and adjusting his behavior accordingly. "Classic trauma responses," she noted in her file. "Hypervigilance, subservient behavior, physical indicators of chronic stress. The boy has been conditioned to anticipate punishment." When Harry accidentally dropped a plate while washing it, both investigators tensed. Petunia Dursley's reaction was swift and harsh, a sharp slap across the boy's face, followed by a torrent of verbal abuse about his clumsiness and ingratitude. Harry accepted the punishment without protest, merely murmuring an apology while pressing his hand to his reddening cheek. "Routine physical punishment for minor accidents," Walsh documented. "No comfort offered, no acknowledgement that the punishment was disproportionate to the offense." "And look at how he's responding," Hendrix added. "He's not surprised or distressed by the violence. This is normal for him." They spent the entire day observing the household, building a comprehensive picture of Harry Potter's daily existence. The boy was fed once, a sparse lunch that consisted mainly of leftovers while Dudley received fresh food and spent most of his time performing household chores under his aunt's critical supervision. When Dudley wanted entertainment, Harry became the target of casual cruelty that his aunt not only permitted, but encouraged. The letter mentioned something called Harry hunting, Walsh noted, as they watched Dudley chase his cousin around the garden, while Petunia Dursley watched approvingly from the kitchen window. This appears to be what he was referring to. The game, if it could be called that, involved Dudley and his friends cornering Harry and subjecting him to physical intimidation that stopped just short of serious violence. When Harry tried to escape into the house, Petunia Dursley blocked his way and sent him back outside to play properly with his cousin. Systematic bullying with parental encouragement, Hendricks wrote in her report. The child has no safe space, no adult protection, no recourse when victimized by other children. By evening, both investigators had filled multiple pages of documentation, each entry more damning than the last. The picture that emerged was exactly what Harry Potter had described in his letter. Systematic abuse designed to make a child feel unwanted, unloved, and utterly powerless. "I've seen enough," Hendricks said, as they watched Harry being locked back into his cupboard for the night without dinner. "This isn't discipline or strict parenting. This is deliberate cruelty masquerading as child-rearing." Walsh nodded, packing away his equipment. "The question now is what we can do about it. The legal framework around magical children in Muggle households is complicated, particularly given the boys' special circumstances." Hendricks started the van's engine, the notice-me-not charm ensuring that none of the neighbors would remember seeing them. "That's above our pay grade. Our job was to gather evidence, and we've done that. The decision about intervention will come from higher up the chain." As they drove away from Privet Drive, both investigators carried with them the image of a 9-year-old boy pressed against his cupboard door, listening for sounds from the world beyond his prison. They had confirmed everything Harry Potter had alleged in his letter, and documented evidence that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Whether the Ministry would have the courage to act on that evidence remained to be seen. But for the first time since Harry Potter had written his desperate letter, someone in authority had witnessed the truth of his daily existence. The investigation had moved beyond paperwork and procedures to the stark reality of a child suffering. And that, Hendricks reflected, as they headed back toward London, was the first step toward justice. The ancient chamber of the Wizengamot had not seen such tension in the 8 years since Voldemort's defeat. 50 witches and wizards sat in the tiered seats that rose in a circle around the central floor, their plum-colored robes creating a sea of solemn authority, marked by the silver W embroidered on each chest. The air itself seemed to thrum with magical energy and political undercurrent, as if the very stones of the Ministry building recognized that the proceedings about to begin would challenge some of the most fundamental assumptions of the wizarding world's leadership. At the apex of the chamber, in the Chief Warlock's chair that had been occupied by the same wizard for over a decade, Albus Dumbledore sat with the weight of institutional authority pressing down upon him like a physical force. His long silver hair caught the light from the floating candles that illuminated the proceedings, and his blue eyes, usually bright with characteristic warmth, had gone grave with the recognition that he was about to preside over a case that would judge his own decisions. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The man who had made the placement decision for Harry Potter 8 years ago would now sit in judgment of whether that decision constituted a failure of duty to a magical child. Protocol demanded that he recuse himself, but protocol also recognized that no other wizard had the authority to convene an emergency session of the Wizengamot on such short notice. The Chief Warlock's position was both his burden and his shield, granting him the power to oversee the proceedings while ensuring that every decision would be scrutinized for bias. "The emergency session of the Wizengamot will come to order," Dumbledore announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, with the authority that had guided the wizarding world through its darkest years. The silver instruments around his chair chimed once, their magical resonance confirming that all members were present and that the necessary quorum had been achieved. The members settled into their seats with the rustle of formal robes and the quiet murmur of whispered consultations. Many had been serving on the Wizengamot for decades, their experience encompassing everything from wartime tribunals to peacetime policy disputes. But few had ever been called to address a case involving the boy who lived. The political implications alone were staggering. Harry Potter's welfare had been entrusted to the very people now being accused of systematic abuse. Senior Investigator Thorne rose from her position at the speaker's podium, her case files arranged with military precision before her. As the lead investigator for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, she bore the responsibility for presenting the evidence that would either vindicate or condemn the guardianship arrangements that had been in place for 8 years. "Chief Warlock, distinguished members of the Wizengamot," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "we are here today to address allegations of serious misconduct in the guardianship of Harry James Potter, placed with Vernon and Petunia Dursley of Little Whinging, Surrey, in November 1981. A ripple of tension moved through the chamber. Several members leaned forward in their seats, while others exchanged meaningful glances that spoke to years of unspoken questions about the famous boy's welfare. The name Harry Potter carried weight that extended far beyond a simple child protection case. This was about the treatment of the wizard who had saved them all, the child whose sacrifice had ended the war and given them the peace they now enjoyed. "The allegations," Thorne continued, consulting her meticulously organized notes, "were brought to our attention through a letter written by the subject himself, Harry Potter, age 9, addressed to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. In this correspondence, the child documented a pattern of systematic abuse and neglect that, if substantiated, would constitute serious violations of basic child welfare standards." Dumbledore's hands remained still on the arms of his chair, but those who knew him well could see the slight tension in his shoulders that spoke to the weight of what was unfolding. As Chief Warlock, he was bound by oath to ensure fair proceedings, regardless of his personal investment in the outcome. As the architect of Harry Potter's placement, he was perhaps the person most responsible for whatever suffering the investigation had uncovered. "The formal reading of charges," Thorne announced, her voice taking on the ceremonial cadence required by Wizengamot protocol, "will address the following allegations against Vernon Dursley and Petunia Dursley, guardians appointed under the authority of the Ministry of Magic and the Chief Warlock of this body." The chamber fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that preceded moments of historical significance. First charge: deliberate deprivation of adequate living quarters. The subject reports being forced to sleep in a cupboard under the stairs for the entirety of his residence with the accused, despite the availability of proper bedrooms within the household. Several Wizengamot members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The image of Harry Potter, sleeping in a cupboard while his cousin enjoyed multiple bedrooms, spoke to a level of deliberate cruelty that challenged everything they had assumed about the boy's welfare. Second charge: systematic deprivation of adequate nutrition. The subject reports routine denial of meals as punishment, forced consumption of substandard food while other household members received adequate nutrition, and deliberate withholding of food during extended periods of confinement. A witch in the third tier raised her hand slightly, then lowered it as she remembered that questions would come during the formal inquiry period. The charges were not mere allegations of occasional strictness. They painted a picture of systematic abuse designed to make a child feel unwanted and worthless. Third charge, physical violence beyond reasonable disciplinary measures. The subject reports routine physical punishment for minor infractions, including but not limited to slapping, grabbing, and forceful confinement. Such punishment appears to have been disproportionate to any alleged misbehavior and designed to intimidate rather than educate. Fourth charge, emotional abuse and systematic psychological harm. The subject reports being repeatedly told that he was unwanted, unloved, and a burden to the household. Such treatment appears to have been calculated to damage the child's sense of self-worth and belonging. Thorne paused, allowing the weight of the charges to settle over the chamber like a heavy cloak. When she spoke again, her voice carried the controlled anger of a professional who had seen too much evidence of child suffering. Fifth charge, deliberate isolation and denial of normal childhood experiences. The subject reports being denied social contact, educational support, recreational activities, and basic acknowledgement of birthdays and holidays. Such deprivation extends beyond discipline into systematic denial of normal human affection and recognition. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft scratching of quills as court reporters documented every word for the official record. These were not the charges of occasional parental harshness or misguided discipline. They described a calculated campaign to break a child's spirit. Dumbledore cleared his throat quietly, his role as chief warlock requiring him to maintain the proceedings despite the personal cost. Senior Investigator Thorne, have these allegations been substantiated through independent verification? Yes, Chief Warlock. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement conducted extensive covert surveillance of the Dursley household over a period of multiple days. We have documented evidence supporting each of the charges I have presented, including direct observation of the living conditions, treatment patterns, and household dynamics described in the subject's letter. A wizard in the front row leaned forward, his expression grim. Investigator Thorne, in your professional assessment, do these conditions constitute actionable violations of child welfare standards? Thorne's response was immediate and unequivocal. In my 15 years of child protection work, I have never encountered a case of more systematic emotional and physical neglect. The conditions described and observed would warrant immediate removal of any magical child from any household, regardless of the political or magical considerations involved. The implications hung heavy in the air. If Harry Potter required immediate removal from his guardians, then every person who had knowledge of his placement, from Dumbledore to the ministry officials who had approved it, bore responsibility for 8 years of preventable suffering. Dumbledore rose slowly from his chair, the weight of his 108 years seeming to press down upon him with particular force. The Wizengamot will recess for 30 minutes to review the documentation presented by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. When we reconvene, we will hear testimony from witnesses and examine the evidence in detail. As the members filed out for consultation, the chamber buzzed with urgent whispered conversations. The formal proceedings had only just begun, but already the magnitude of the case was clear to everyone present. This was not merely a child protection matter. This was a reckoning with the decisions made in the dark aftermath of war, when survival had seemed more important than comfort and protection had taken precedence over love. Dumbledore remained in his chair as the chamber emptied, staring down at the empty floor where Harry Potter would soon stand to testify about 8 years of systematic abuse. The boy who had saved the wizarding world had been failed by the very people he had saved, and now they would all face the consequences of that failure. The formal charges had been read. The evidence would be presented. The testimony would be heard. And in the end, the Wizengamot would decide whether the wizarding world had the courage to admit that their hero had been sacrificed not once, but twice. First to defeat Voldemort, and then to an idea of protection that had proved more dangerous than the threats it was meant to prevent. The Wizengamot chamber felt different when it reconvened, charged with an anticipation that made the very air seem to hum with tension. The 50 members had returned to their plum-colored seats with expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely contained outrage, their 30-minute recess having provided ample time to digest the implications of the charges that had been formally read. Dumbledore resumed his position as Chief Warlock with visible reluctance, his blue eyes reflecting none of their usual warmth as he surveyed the chamber. "We will now proceed to the witness testimony phase of these proceedings," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the next hour would irrevocably change how the wizarding world viewed its most fundamental assumptions about protection and care. Senior Investigator Thorne rose first, her case files arranged with meticulous precision. "Chief Warlock, distinguished members, I will present the evidence gathered during our investigation, followed by testimony from witnesses who can speak to both the current conditions and the historical context of Harry Potter's placement." She activated a magical display that projected images into the center of the chamber, photographs taken through omnioculars that showed the interior of 4 Privet Drive in stark, undeniable detail. The cupboard under the stairs appeared first, its cramped dimensions and sparse furnishings rendering several Wizengamot members visibly uncomfortable. "This is where Harry Potter has slept for 8 years, Thorne stated without emotion, though her professional control could not entirely mask her disgust. The space measures approximately 4 feet by 6 feet, with no window, no proper ventilation, and locks operated from the outside. For comparison, the display shifted to show Dudley Dursley's bedroom, complete with multiple toys and a proper bed. This is the sleeping arrangement provided for the Dursley family's biological child." A murmur of dismay rippled through the chamber. The contrast was so stark, so deliberately cruel, that even the most hardened members found themselves leaning forward in their seats. "Our surveillance documented a pattern of systematic deprivation," Thorne continued, the magical display showing timestamps and detailed observations. "Food withheld as punishment, physical violence for minor infractions, emotional abuse designed to make the child feel worthless and unwanted. The evidence was methodical, devastating, and impossible to dismiss." By the time Thorne concluded her presentation, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted from judicial skepticism to something approaching horror. "The Ministry calls its first witness," Dumbledore announced, though his voice had grown notably quieter. "Professor Minerva McGonagall." McGonagall rose from her seat among the observers with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. But her usual stern composure was tinged with something that looked very much like shame. She took her place at the witness stand and faced the assembled Wizengamot with the bearing of someone who had come to speak truth, regardless of personal cost. "Professor McGonagall," Thorne began, "you were present on November 1st, 1981, when Harry Potter was placed with the Dursley family. Please describe your observations from that day." McGonagall's voice was steady, but heavy with regret. "I observed the Dursley family for an entire day before the placement occurred. In that time, I witnessed behavior that I found deeply concerning. Vernon Dursley displayed casual cruelty toward animals. Petunia Dursley showed petty malice toward her neighbors. The child, Dudley, exhibited the behavior patterns of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted, including the right to be cruel to others when frustrated. Did you express these concerns to the Chief Warlock?" "I did. I stated explicitly that the Dursleys were the worst sort of muggles, and expressed strong reservations about placing any child in their care, much less one as significant as Harry Potter." And how were your concerns addressed? McGonagall's gaze flicked briefly toward Dumbledore before returning to the Wizengamot. They were acknowledged, but ultimately dismissed in favor of other considerations. I was told that the placement was necessary for reasons of magical protection. The chamber fell silent as the implications settled. The deputy headmistress of Hogwarts had warned against the placement 8 years ago, and her warnings had been ignored. "Professor McGonagall," said a witch from the 3rd tier, "in your professional opinion, should different arrangements have been made for Harry Potter's care?" McGonagall's response was immediate and unequivocal. Yes, any number of wizarding families would have provided better care while maintaining whatever protections were deemed necessary. The decision to place him with people who were demonstrably unsuited to raise any child, much less a magical one, was a grave error that could have been avoided. The weight of her words hung in the chamber like an accusation. McGonagall returned to her seat, leaving behind a silence that spoke to years of institutional failure and missed opportunities. "The Ministry calls Harry James Potter." The side door of the chamber opened, and a small figure entered, flanked by 2 Ministry officials. Harry Potter walked into the Wizengamot chamber, with the careful steps of someone who had learned that sudden movements could bring punishment, his green eyes wide as he took in the circular chamber, with its 50 robed figures watching his every movement. He was smaller than many of the assembled members had expected, thin in a way that spoke to chronic undernourishment rather than natural build. His black hair stuck up at odd angles, and his clothes, clearly hand-me-downs from a much larger child, hung off his small frame like fabric sacks. But it was his eyes that captured attention, bright green and alert, but holding a wariness that no 9-year-old should have had to develop. Dumbledore's voice was gentler now, though the formal requirements of the proceedings remained unchanged. "Harry, do you understand why you're here today?" Harry's voice was quiet but clear, carrying the careful politeness of a child who had learned that the wrong tone could bring swift punishment. "Yes, sir. It's about the letter I wrote. About how the Dursleys treat me. Can you tell us in your own words what life is like at Privet Drive?" Harry glanced around the chamber, clearly overwhelmed by the formal setting, and the dozens of adults focused on his every word. When he spoke, it was with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone recounting simple facts rather than traumatic experiences. "I sleep in the cupboard under the stairs. I always have. Uncle Vernon says I should be grateful to have a roof over my head at all, because my parents were drunks who died in a car crash and left me with nothing." A sharp intake of breath from several Wizengamot members greeted this casual repetition of the lies he had been told about his parents' death. "Sometimes I don't get fed for a whole day if I've done something wrong. Or sometimes if I haven't done anything wrong, but Dudley's in a bad mood and wants someone to blame. When I do get food, it's usually whatever's left after everyone else has eaten." Harry's voice remained steady, but his hands fidgeted with the hem of his oversized shirt. "Dudley likes to play games where he and his friends chase me and corner me. Aunt Petunia calls it playing properly and sends me back outside if I try to come in the house. She says I need to learn to get along with other children, but really Dudley just likes to scare me." "Harry," Thorne said gently, "can you tell us about the strange things that sometimes happen around you?" Harry's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time he looked genuinely frightened. "I'm not supposed to talk about that. Uncle Vernon says it proves I'm a freak, that there's something wrong with me. Sometimes glass breaks when I'm angry, or my hair grows back overnight after Aunt Petunia cuts it short. Uncle Vernon says those things are why I deserve everything that happens to me." The chamber was absolutely silent now, every member hanging on the words of a 9-year-old boy who had been told that his own magical abilities made him deserving of abuse. When Uncle Vernon gets really angry, he grabs me and shakes me and tells me I'm worthless. He says I'm nothing but a burden and that I should be grateful they don't throw me out on the street. Aunt Petunia says my mother was a freak, just like me, and that's why she died. Harry's voice finally wavered slightly on the last sentence, but he continued with the determined honesty that had driven him to write his letter in the first place. I know other children don't live like this because I see them at school. They have their own rooms and their parents pack them proper lunches and hug them when they pick them up. I've never had any of that. I don't even know what it feels like to have someone be happy to see me. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of several Wizengamot members wiping their eyes. This was not the testimony of a child seeking attention or exaggerating for effect. This was the simple, devastating truth of 8 years of systematic abuse delivered with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had known no other life. "Thank you, Harry," Dumbledore said quietly. "You've been very brave." As Harry was escorted from the chamber, the weight of his testimony settled over the assembled members like a heavy cloak. The boy who had saved the wizarding world from Voldemort had been systematically broken down by the very people entrusted with his care, told that his magical nature made him deserving of cruelty, and denied even the most basic human kindnesses. The formal phase of testimony was complete. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses had spoken, and the truth, in all its unvarnished horror, now lay before the Wizengamot, like an accusation that could not be ignored or rationalized away. The time for deliberation and decision had arrived. The Wizengamot chamber had never felt heavier with the weight of decision than it did in the moments following Harry Potter's testimony. 50 witches and wizards sat in their plum-colored robes, each one grappling with the impossible choice between a child's immediate welfare and the magical protections that had kept him alive for 8 years. The evidence was undeniable, the testimony devastating, but the implications of action or inaction stretched far beyond the walls of the ancient chamber. Dumbledore rose slowly from the Chief Warlock's chair, his 108 years seeming to press down upon him with particular force. The irony of his position was not lost on anyone present. The man who had architected Harry Potter's placement would now oversee the vote that would judge whether that placement had been a catastrophic error. "The testimony phase is now complete," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite its subdued tone. "We will proceed to deliberation. Any member who wishes to speak to the matter before us may do so." A witch in the second tier stood immediately, her face flushed with barely contained anger. "Chief Warlock, I fail to see how this requires deliberation. We have heard testimony of systematic abuse, seen evidence of deliberate cruelty, and witnessed the testimony of a child who has been told that his magical nature makes him deserving of punishment. How is there any question about what must be done?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the chamber, but a wizard near the front raised his hand for recognition. "Madam Clearwater raises important points, but we cannot ignore the complex magical considerations involved. The blood protection that has shielded Harry Potter from Voldemort's remaining followers requires specific conditions to maintain. If we remove the boy from his current placement, we may expose him to dangers far greater than domestic unpleasantness." "Domestic unpleasantness?" McGonagall's voice cut across the chamber like a blade, though she had not been formally recognized to speak. "A 9-year-old child sleeping in a cupboard, denied food, told he is worthless. This is not domestic unpleasantness. This is systematic abuse that would warrant criminal charges in any other context." Dumbledore gestured for order, though his own expression suggested he shared McGonagall's outrage at the minimization of Harry's suffering. Professor McGonagall, while your points are well taken, I must ask you to observe proper procedures. An elderly wizard in the back tier stood with obvious difficulty, his voice carrying the authority of decades of experience. I have served on this body for 40 years, and I have never encountered a case that so clearly demonstrates the conflict between abstract principle and human reality. Yes, the blood protection is real. Yes, it has likely prevented assassination attempts. But at what cost? We are asking a child to endure years of systematic abuse for our peace of mind. With respect, Wizard Thornfield, interjected a younger member, the peace of mind in question belongs to the entire wizarding world. Harry Potter's survival ensures that Voldemort cannot return in any meaningful form. The protection that requires him to call his aunt's house home is not merely convenient, it is essential. And if he cannot call it home because it has become a place of torment? Asked another member. What happens to protection built on a foundation of fear and resentment rather than love and acceptance? The debate that followed revealed the fundamental fractures in Wizarding Society's approach to Harry Potter's welfare. Some members argued passionately for immediate removal, citing their legal and moral obligations to protect magical children. Others insisted that the blood protection was too valuable to risk, that Harry's suffering, while regrettable, was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Dumbledore listened to each speaker with growing heaviness, recognizing that every argument reflected his own internal struggle over the past 8 years. He had gambled with a child's welfare, staking Harry's happiness against the promise of magical protection, and now that gamble was being examined under the harsh light of institutional scrutiny. When the debate had continued for nearly an hour, a witch in the 3rd tier stood with obvious determination. I propose that we face the central question directly. Do we believe that any level of magical protection justifies allowing a child to suffer systematic abuse? Because that is what we are really deciding here. The chamber fell silent as the stark nature of the choice was laid bare. This was not a complex legal question about jurisdictional boundaries or procedural requirements. This was a moral test of the wizarding world's fundamental values. I call for formal debate on the motion, Dumbledore announced, though his voice carried none of its usual warmth. The question before us is whether to order the immediate removal of Harry Potter from the custody of Vernon and Petunia Dursley, with subsequent arrangements to be determined by this body. The formal debate that followed was more structured, but no less passionate. Members spoke in turn, their arguments ranging from legal precedent to moral philosophy to practical concerns about alternative placements. The weight of decision pressed down upon them all. They were not merely ruling on a guardianship case, but defining what the wizarding world valued more: safety or humanity, protection or love. When the last speaker had concluded, Dumbledore rose for what many suspected would be his most difficult moment as Chief Warlock. Before we proceed to the vote, I must address my own role in this matter. 8 years ago, I made the decision to place Harry Potter with his maternal relatives, believing that the blood protection afforded by that placement outweighed other considerations. I believed that love might grow where blood had commanded it, and that the protection offered would be worth any temporary discomfort. He paused, his blue eyes reflecting the full weight of his century of experience. I was wrong. Not about the reality of the protection, that remains as strong as ever, but about the cost of maintaining it. No child should have to endure what Harry Potter has endured, regardless of the magical benefits such endurance might provide. The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the chamber. Albus Dumbledore had rarely acknowledged error in his decades of leadership, and certainly never with such stark honesty. However, he continued. "My personal feelings about past decisions cannot override my duty to ensure fair proceedings. The vote must be taken based on the evidence and arguments presented, not on the regrets of one old man who wishes he had chosen differently." The formal vote, when it came, was conducted with all the ceremony that 8 centuries of magical law demanded. Each member of the Wizengamot was called upon by name to cast their vote by show of hands, their decisions recorded for the permanent archive. All those in favour of ordering the immediate removal of Harry Potter from the custody of Vernon and Petunia Dursley? Hands rose throughout the chamber, some immediately, others after moments of visible struggle. The count was methodical, witnessed by multiple scribes to ensure accuracy. All those opposed to the motion? Fewer hands rose this time, belonging to members who believed that magical protection trumped all other considerations, or who felt that alternative arrangements could not provide adequate security. All those abstaining from the vote? A handful of members raised their hands, unable to choose between the competing imperatives of protection and welfare. The chief scribe stood to announce the results, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. The motion to order immediate removal passes by a vote of 32 in favour, 14 opposed, 4 abstentions. The silence that followed was profound, charged with the recognition that the wizarding world had just made one of the most significant decisions in its modern history. Harry Potter would be removed from the only home he had ever known, not because that home was loving, but because it had become a place of systematic cruelty. Dumbledore's voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority when he spoke. "The Wizengamot has spoken. Harry Potter will be removed from the custody of Vernon and Petunia Dursley immediately. This body will reconvene within the week to determine appropriate alternative arrangements for his care and protection." As the members began filing out of the chamber, their formal robes rustling with the weight of history, the magnitude of what had been decided settled over them like a heavy cloak. They had chosen humanity over security, love over protection, the immediate welfare of one child over the abstract safety of their entire community. Whether that choice would prove wise or catastrophic remained to be seen. But for the first time in 8 years, Harry Potter's welfare had been placed above all other considerations. The boy who had saved the wizarding world had finally been deemed worthy of saving himself. In a small room adjacent to the chamber, Harry Potter sat quietly between 2 ministry officials, unaware that his life had just changed forever. Soon, someone would come to explain that he would never have to return to the cupboard under the stairs, never again be locked away for the crime of existing, never again be told that he was worthless and unwanted. The Wizengamot had spoken. Justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Harry Potter sat in the passenger seat of Professor McGonagall's sensible sedan, watching the countryside roll past through windows that had been charmed, though he didn't know it yet, to prevent anyone from seeing in. His small hands clutched a bag containing everything he owned: 3 oversized shirts, 2 pairs of trousers with frayed hems, undergarments that had seen better days, and the broken trainers that had been Dudley's cast-offs. It wasn't much to show for 9 years of life, but it was more than he'd expected to take with him when the ministry officials had arrived at Privet Drive that morning. "Where are we going?" Harry asked quietly, his voice carrying the careful politeness that had become second nature after years of learning that the wrong tone could bring swift punishment. McGonagall glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her square spectacles reflecting her concern. "To my cottage in the Scottish Highlands. It's not grand, but it's warm and safe, and you'll have a proper room of your own." Harry absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance he had developed for all the inexplicable changes that seemed to happen around him. Adults made decisions about his life without consulting him. That was simply how the world worked. The difference was that this adult had spoken kindly to him during the strange proceedings in London, had looked genuinely angry when he described life at Privet Drive, and had promised that no one would ever lock him in a cupboard again. "Will I still go to school?" he asked after a moment. School was the one place where he had found brief respites from the Dursleys' cruelty, even if Dudley's presence there meant he could never entirely escape their influence. "You'll go to the local primary school in the village," McGonagall replied. "A fresh start where no one knows anything about your previous circumstances." Harry nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what circumstances she meant. The trial in London had been confusing, all those adults in strange robes talking about protection and guardianship and systematic abuse. He'd understood that they were angry about how Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia treated him, but he still didn't quite grasp why that mattered to strangers in government offices. The cottage, when they arrived, was unlike anything Harry had ever seen. It sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its stone walls covered in ivy, and its windows glowing warmly in the afternoon light. A garden bloomed around the front door, filled with flowers whose names he didn't know, and smoke rose peacefully from the chimney despite the summer warmth. "Welcome home, Harry," McGonagall said simply as she opened the car door. Home. The word felt strange in his mouth when he tried to repeat it silently. The Dursleys had always made it clear that Privet Drive was their home, and he was merely an unwelcome guest, a burden to be endured rather than a family member to be cherished. This place, with its ivy-covered walls and cheerful garden, didn't look like anywhere he belonged. McGonagall led him through the front door, into a sitting room that seemed to have grown organically over decades. Mismatched but comfortable furniture surrounded a stone fireplace, and bookshelves lined every available wall. The air smelled of tea and old paper and something Harry couldn't identify, but found immediately comforting. "Your room is upstairs," McGonagall said, leading him up a narrow staircase that creaked pleasantly under their feet. "I've made up the bed, but we'll need to get you proper clothes and books and anything else you might want." She opened a door to reveal a space that made Harry's breath catch in his throat. It was small but warm, with a window that looked out over the garden and hills beyond. A real bed stood against one wall, covered with a quilt in shades of green and gold. There was a desk by the window, a wardrobe for clothes, and shelves that waited to be filled with his possessions. "It's mine?" he asked quietly, as if speaking too loudly might make it disappear. "It's yours," McGonagall confirmed. "No one will ever lock you away again, Harry. No one will ever deny you food or proper clothing or simple human kindness. Those days are over." Harry sat carefully on the edge of the bed, testing whether it would support his weight. The mattress was soft in a way that the thin padding in his cupboard had never been, and the pillows smelled like lavender instead of dust and cleaning supplies. "Why?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop himself. McGonagall settled into a chair by the window, her expression gentle, in a way that seemed natural rather than forced. "Why what, dear? Why are you being kind to me? Why do I get a room and a bed and—" He gestured helplessly at the space around him. "Uncle Vernon always said I should be grateful for whatever I got, because I was nothing but trouble. Why are you treating me like I matter?" The pain in McGonagall's chest was sharp and immediate. That a 9-year-old child could ask such a question, could genuinely not understand why he deserved basic human decency, spoke to the systematic damage the Dursleys had inflicted on his sense of self-worth. "You matter because you're a human being," she said firmly. "Every child deserves kindness and safety and love, and you are no exception. The people who told you otherwise were wrong, Harry. Deeply, cruelly wrong." Harry absorbed this quietly, though she could see the skepticism in his green eyes. 9 years of being told he was worthless couldn't be undone with a single conversation, no matter how sincere. "There are some things about yourself that you don't know yet," McGonagall continued carefully. "Important things that will be explained when you're older. But what you need to understand right now is that you are wanted here. This is your home for as long as you need it to be." Over the following days, Harry began to experience a version of childhood he had never imagined possible. McGonagall woke him gently each morning, rather than pounding on his door and shouting commands. She prepared proper meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and encouraged him to eat as much as he wanted, rather than rationing his food as punishment. When he accidentally broke a plate while helping with the washing up, she simply vanished the pieces with a casual flick of her hand and told him accidents happened to everyone. Harry stared at the spot where the broken ceramic had been, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. McGonagall realized her mistake immediately. She had become so accustomed to using magic for everyday tasks that she had forgotten Harry knew nothing of the magical world yet. The official guidelines stated that magical children weren't to be formally introduced to their heritage until their Hogwarts letters arrived, but surely some explanation was warranted given his circumstances. "It's called magic, Harry," she said gently. "It's something that some people can do, and something you'll be able to do when you're older and properly trained." Harry's eyes went wide. "Magic? Like in fairy tales?" "Something like that, yes. The strange things that have happened around you. Glass breaking when you're upset, your hair growing back overnight. Those are signs that you have magical ability. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and it certainly doesn't make you a freak." The relief that flooded Harry's face was heartbreaking. For years he had been told that the unexplainable incidents around him proved there was something wrong with him, something that justified the Dursleys' cruelty. To learn that these abilities were not only normal, but valuable, was like discovering that the thing he had been most ashamed of was actually a gift. "Will you teach me?" he asked eagerly. "When you're older," McGonagall promised. "For now, you need to learn how to be a child first, how to play and laugh and feel safe. The magic will wait." As the weeks passed, Harry began to understand what Professor McGonagall had meant about learning to be a child. She encouraged him to explore the hills around the cottage, to read books for pleasure rather than just schoolwork, to ask questions about anything that interested him. When he admitted he had never owned a toy that was new, she took him to the village shop and told him to choose whatever caught his eye. He selected a small wooden train set, not because he particularly wanted it, but because it was the least expensive item that seemed to qualify as a toy. McGonagall gently suggested he might want something more exciting, but Harry clutched the train set protectively and insisted it was perfect. That evening, she found him in his room, carefully arranging the wooden pieces on his desk, his face lit with a wonder she had never seen before. He looked up when she entered, his green eyes bright with excitement. "It's really mine?" he asked. "No one else has ever played with it?" "It's really yours," she confirmed, "and no one will ever take it away from you." Harry smiled then, a genuine, unreserved expression of happiness that transformed his entire face. It was the first time McGonagall had seen him smile without reservation, and she had to turn away to hide the tears that suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. 9 years old, she thought sadly. 9 years old and amazed by the concept of owning something new, something chosen just for him. The Dursleys had stolen not just his comfort and safety, but his very understanding of what childhood could be. But they would steal nothing more from him. In this cottage in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by books and kindness and the promise of magic yet to come, Harry Potter was finally learning what it meant to be a child who was wanted and loved. The healing had begun. The office of the Chief Warlock had never felt so much like a prison as it did in the weeks following the Wizengamot's decision. Albus Dumbledore sat behind his ancient desk, staring at the formal parchment that would reshape not only his own future, but the entire structure of magical child protection services. The letter bore the seals of both the Minister for Magic and the full Wizengamot, a rare show of institutional unity that spoke to the magnitude of what had been decided. Following the findings of gross negligence in the placement and oversight of Harry James Potter, the letter began in the precise language of bureaucracy. This body hereby establishes the following reforms to prevent future failures of institutional duty. The reforms were comprehensive and pointed. All future placements of magical children with Muggle families would require regular monitoring by qualified social workers. The new Department of Magical Child Welfare would operate independently of any single official's authority, preventing the concentration of power that had allowed Harry's situation to continue unchecked. Most personally devastating of all, the Chief Warlock position would be subject to a vote of no confidence, the first time in the Wizengamot's 800-year history that such a measure had been implemented. Dumbledore set the parchment aside and removed his half-moon spectacles, feeling every one of his 108 years weighing upon him. He had devoted his life to the protection of the wizarding world, had made countless difficult decisions in service of the greater good, but none of those sacrifices could justify what Harry Potter had endured under his authority. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come," he called, though he suspected he knew who would enter. Professor McGonagall stepped into the office with her characteristic brisk efficiency, but her usual stern expression was tempered with something that might have been sympathy. "The Prophet wants a statement about the reforms," she said, without preamble. "And the Board of Governors has requested a meeting about your continued tenure as headmaster." Dumbledore nodded slowly. The political fallout had been swift and merciless, as he had expected it would be. The wizarding world's most trusted leader had been revealed to have systematically failed its most important child, and the institutions that had supported him were scrambling to distance themselves from that failure. "I'll submit my resignation from the Chief Warlock position this afternoon," he said quietly. "As for Hogwarts, the governors will decide what they feel is best for the school." McGonagall's expression softened slightly. "Albus, no one doubts your dedication to the school or your students. What happened with Harry was a grievous error, but it doesn't erase decades of service to magical education." "Doesn't it?" Dumbledore asked, his blue eyes reflecting a weariness that made him appear ancient. "I placed institutional convenience above a child's welfare. I prioritized abstract, magical protection over basic human kindness. How can I claim to have the judgment necessary to educate children when I failed so completely to protect one?" The question hung between them like a weight neither could lift. McGonagall had spent years defending Dumbledore's decisions, trusting in his wisdom, even when her own instincts rebelled against it. But Harry Potter's testimony had shattered that trust, revealing the human cost of the blind faith she had placed in institutional authority. "The boy is healing," she offered finally. "He's learning what it means to be loved and protected. Perhaps that's what matters now, not our regrets about the past, but our commitment to his future." Dumbledore managed a small smile. "How is he adjusting to his new circumstances?" "Better than I dared hope. He's resilient in ways that break my heart. Yesterday he thanked me for giving him breakfast, as if regular meals were a privilege rather than a basic right." McGonagall's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had seen firsthand the damage systematic abuse could inflict. "It will take time to undo the Dursleys' conditioning, but he's young enough that the healing may be complete." Across the castle, in the dungeons where the potions classroom lay shrouded in shadows and the scent of preserved ingredients, Severus Snape sat alone among his cauldrons and tried to make sense of the rage that had been consuming him for weeks. He had known, of course, that Potter was alive. The entire wizarding world knew that much, but he had assumed, as everyone had, that the boy was living a life of comfort and safety, cherished as the hero who had saved them all from the Dark Lord's terror. The revelation that Lily's son had instead endured years of systematic abuse at the hands of his Muggle relatives had shaken Snape in ways he was still struggling to understand. The irony was bitter beyond bearing. He had spent 8 years despising James Potter's memory, nurturing his resentment toward the man who had humiliated him and won Lily's heart. But James Potter was beyond the reach of earthly justice, while his son, Lily's son, had been suffering in ways that made Snape's own difficult childhood seem almost gentle by comparison. He thought of the green eyes he would see in 2 years' time when Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts, and wondered how he would bear to look into them, knowing what he now knew. Those eyes would carry not just Lily's physical heritage, but the accumulated damage of 9 years of deliberate cruelty inflicted by people who should have protected him. The boy would arrive broken, cautious, trained to expect punishment rather than care. He would flinch from raised voices and unexpected movements. He would be grateful for basic kindness in ways that would shame any adult with a functioning conscience. And Severus Snape, who had planned to make Harry Potter's life at Hogwarts a misery in payment for his father's crimes, would instead be faced with a child who had already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. The rage that filled him now was not for James Potter, but for Vernon and Petunia Dursley, who had taken their petty prejudices and small-minded cruelty and used them to systematically destroy a child's sense of self-worth. It was rage for Albus Dumbledore, who had prioritized magical theory over human suffering. Most of all, it was rage for himself, for the years he had wasted planning revenge against a child who had already been punished far beyond anything Snape could have devised. At the Ministry of Magic, the newly established Department of Magical Child Welfare was taking shape with unprecedented speed and funding. Senior Investigator Thorne had been appointed as its first director, her success in the Potter case making her the obvious choice for the position. We'll need to review every current placement of magical children with non-magical families, she explained to her hastily assembled staff. The Potter case may have been extreme, but we have no way of knowing how many other children are suffering in silence. The scope of the task was daunting. Magical children placed with Muggle relatives, magical children in foster care, magical children whose parents had died without clear guardianship arrangements, all would now be subject to regular monitoring and assessment by trained professionals. What about resistance from families who claim we're interfering with their privacy? Asked one of the new social workers. Thorne's expression was grim. Privacy ends where a child's welfare begins. The Wizengamot has given us broad authority to investigate any situation where a magical child's safety may be at risk. If families don't like the scrutiny, they can petition the courts, but they'll have to explain why they object to ensuring their children are properly cared for. The reforms extended beyond placement oversight. New protocols for recognizing and reporting signs of abuse were being implemented throughout the magical community. Training programs for teachers, healers, and ministry workers were being developed. Most importantly, a legal framework was being established that would make it impossible for any single individual, no matter how respected or powerful, to override child welfare concerns in the name of abstract principles. The minister wants to know if we think there are other cases out there, said another worker. Other children who might be in situations similar to Harry Potter's. Thorne considered the question seriously. I hope not. But hope isn't good enough anymore. We're going to find out, one way or another. The political consequences extended far beyond individual careers or departmental restructuring. The Potter case had exposed fundamental flaws in how the magical community approached child welfare, revealing a system that prioritized institutional convenience over individual suffering. Editorials in the Daily Prophet called for a complete overhaul of magical child protection services. Letters from concerned parents demanded assurances that their own children would never suffer as Harry Potter had suffered. The very foundations of trust between magical families and their institutions had been shaken. But perhaps most importantly, the case had established a new principle in magical law. No consideration of magical protection, institutional convenience, or political expedience could justify allowing a child to suffer abuse. The rights of magical children to safety, care, and basic human dignity had been formally recognized and legally protected for the first time in the magical community's history. Change was coming to the wizarding world, driven by the simple truth that a 9-year-old boy had been brave enough to document his own suffering in a letter to strangers. The institutions that had failed him were being rebuilt. The individuals responsible for his placement were facing consequences. The legal framework that had allowed his abuse to continue was being dismantled and replaced. It was too late to give Harry Potter the childhood he deserved, but it was not too late to ensure that no other magical child would suffer as he had suffered. The healing of one boy had begun, but so had the healing of an entire society that had lost sight of its most basic obligation, to protect those who could not protect themselves. In the end, Harry Potter had saved the wizarding world twice, once from Voldemort's darkness and once from its own willingness to sacrifice children on the altar of institutional convenience. The boy who lived had become the boy who changed everything. 6 months had passed since Harry Potter had written his letter to the Ministry, and the cottage in the Scottish Highlands had begun to feel like something he'd never experienced before. Home. Not the bitter irony of the word as the Dursleys had used it, their home where he was merely tolerated, but a place where he belonged, where his presence was welcomed rather than endured. Harry knelt in Professor McGonagall's garden on a crisp October morning, carefully planting bulbs that would bloom into daffodils come spring. The earth was cold against his fingers, but he found he enjoyed the simple task of placing each bulb at the proper depth and covering it with soil. There was something satisfying about the promise of it, that these small, unremarkable brown lumps would transform into bright yellow flowers when the world warmed again. "You're getting quite good at that," McGonagall observed from the cottage doorway, a warm cup of tea steaming in her hands. Mrs. Henderson from the village says she's never seen a child take to gardening so naturally. Harry looked up from his work, soil smudged across his cheek and his green eyes bright with satisfaction. "It's nice to watch things grow," he said simply, "to know that something good will happen because of what you do today." The words carried weight beyond their surface, meaning, and McGonagall felt her heart constrict with recognition of the deeper truth they contained. This was a child who had spent 9 years watching his actions result only in punishment and rejection, who was still learning that effort could lead to reward rather than retribution. "Speaking of growing things," she said, settling onto the garden bench nearby, "I had a letter from your teacher today. Miss Campbell says you're doing remarkably well with your reading." Harry's face lit up with the unguarded pleasure that still surprised him when it appeared. In his previous life, academic achievement had been dangerous, performing too well meant accusations of showing off, while performing poorly brought punishment for stupidity. Here, his accomplishments were celebrated without reservation. "I finished the book about the boy and his dragon," he reported eagerly. "Miss Campbell said I could pick any book from the library for my next project." "And which did you choose?" "The one about astronomy," Harry said, his expression growing thoughtful. "About stars and planets and how they move through the sky. I want to understand how people figured all that out just by watching." McGonagall smiled, recognizing the keen intelligence that had always been there beneath the Dursleys' systematic attempts to suppress it. Harry's natural curiosity was beginning to emerge after years of being told that questions were unwelcome and knowledge was dangerous. He devoured books now, with the hunger of someone making up for lost time. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said suddenly, setting down his trowel and looking at her, with the directness she had learned, meant he was about to ask something important. "Why did the people in London care about how the Dursleys treated me? I was nobody special to them." It was a question she had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. How did one explain to a 9-year-old that he was not nobody special, that he was, in fact, the most famous child in their entire world? How did one begin to describe the magical heritage that awaited him without overwhelming a mind that was still healing from trauma? "You are special, Harry," she said carefully. "More special than you know. But not because of anything you've done or anything you need to prove. You're special because you're you. Because you have a kind heart and a sharp mind and the courage to ask for help when you need it." Harry absorbed this with the thoughtful expression he wore when processing new concepts. "Will you tell me more about it someday? About why those people in the robes cared so much about me?" "When you're older," McGonagall promised. "When you're ready to understand all of it. For now, the most important thing is that you're safe and loved and free to be the child you were always meant to be." Harry nodded, accepting this as he had learned to accept the many gentle deferrals of complete explanation that marked his new life. Professor McGonagall never lied to him, but she sometimes said that certain truths were for later, when he was ready. He had learned to trust that later would come, and that the waiting was not punishment, but protection. As autumn deepened into winter, Harry's world expanded in small but significant ways. He made his first real friend at school, a girl named Emma, who shared his love of books and didn't seem to mind that he sometimes flinched when voices were raised or that he ate his lunches as though he expected them to be taken away. Emma invited him to her birthday party, the first such invitation he had ever received, and McGonagall helped him choose an appropriate gift and taught him the social rituals he had never been permitted to learn. The party was a revelation. Harry watched in fascination as children played games for the simple joy of playing, as adults smiled and laughed without underlying cruelty, as Emma's parents took photographs to preserve happy memories rather than seeking evidence of misbehavior. When Emma's mother cut the cake and made sure every child received an equal slice, made sure Harry received an equal slice, he had to excuse himself to the garden until the overwhelming gratitude subsided. "It's normal," McGonagall explained gently when he tried to articulate why the simple act of being included had affected him so strongly. "Children are supposed to be included in celebrations. You're supposed to receive invitations and gifts and cake at parties. The fact that it feels extraordinary to you now is not because there's anything wrong with you, but because you were denied these basic experiences for too long." Winter brought new discoveries. Harry's first Christmas at the cottage was a careful, gentle affair, designed not to overwhelm a child who had never experienced the holiday as anything other than a reminder of his exclusion from the Dursley family's joy. McGonagall had wrapped 3 modest gifts and placed them under a small tree, explaining that this was how families celebrated the season together. When Harry unwrapped a book of myths and legends, a warm winter coat that fit him properly, and a wooden chess set, his reaction was so quiet that McGonagall initially worried she had miscalculated. But when she looked closer, she saw tears sliding silently down his cheeks, not tears of distress, but of wonder. "They're really for me," he whispered. "Not hand-me-downs or mistakes." "They're really for you," she confirmed. "Chosen specifically for you because I thought you would enjoy them." Harry spent the rest of Christmas Day reading his new book while wearing his new coat, occasionally looking up to study the chess pieces as though trying to memorize them. That evening, as McGonagall tucked him into his bed, another ritual he was still learning to accept, he spoke the words that nearly broke her heart with their simple sincerity. "This was the best day of my life," he said matter-of-factly. "Thank you for giving me a best day." Spring brought its own milestones. The daffodil bulbs Harry had planted sprouted green shoots that pushed through the soil with determined optimism, and he checked on them every morning with the dedication of someone witnessing a miracle. His nightmares became less frequent, appearing now perhaps once a week rather than nightly. He stopped automatically apologizing for taking up space or asking for things he needed. Most remarkably, he began to laugh. The first time McGonagall heard his genuine laughter, not the careful, controlled response he offered when he thought humor was expected, but the helpless, delighted sound of a child caught off guard by joy. She had to step into the kitchen and compose herself before she could respond appropriately. It had happened while they were reading together, when a character in their book had made a particularly ridiculous mistake, and Harry's amusement had bubbled up without self-consciousness or fear of consequences. "I made a noise," he said wonderfully, as though he'd discovered he could fly. "You laughed," McGonagall confirmed. "It's something people do when they find things funny." "I know what laughing is," Harry said, with the dignity of someone whose intelligence had been underestimated. I never did it before. Not really." As summer approached and Harry's 10th birthday drew near, McGonagall began preparing for the most significant celebration yet. She had written to several of her colleagues, seeking advice on how to create a proper birthday party for a child who had never experienced one. The consensus was simple: cake, friends, presents, and games. The normal components of childhood joy, offered without reservation or condition. On the morning of July 31st, Harry woke to find his bedroom decorated with colourful streamers and a handmade banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Harry," in McGonagall's careful script. Emma and 3 other children from school had been invited for the afternoon, and the kitchen table held a chocolate cake with 10 candles waiting to be lit. "Make a wish," McGonagall instructed, when the time came for Harry to blow out the candles. Harry closed his green eyes and thought carefully. A year ago, he would have wished to escape the Dursleys, or for enough food, or for someone to care whether he lived or died. Today, surrounded by friends and warmth and the promise of cake, he found himself wishing for something he had never dared hope for before, that this happiness could last, that the people who cared about him would continue to care, that the future could be as bright as this single perfect moment. He blew out the candles in one breath, and the children cheered as though he had accomplished something magnificent. That evening, after the guests had gone home, and the dishes were washed and put away, Harry sat in his favourite chair by the window, reading his new book while McGonagall graded papers nearby. The contentment that filled the room was quiet but profound, the companionable silence of people who had learned to be comfortable in each other's presence. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said eventually, not looking up from his book but needing to speak the words that had been building in his chest all day. "I know you said I'm special, and maybe someday I'll understand what you mean. But even if I'm not special at all, even if I'm just ordinary, this is enough. Being here with you, having friends, knowing that tomorrow will be safe, it's more than enough. It's everything." McGonagall set down her quill and looked at the boy who had survived so much and was learning, slowly but surely, to thrive. His dark hair caught the last light from the window, and his green eyes held a peace that had been earned through months of careful healing. He was still too thin, still carried himself with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily, still sometimes woke in the night, confused about where he was. But he was also growing stronger each day, more confident in his place in the world, more willing to believe that good things could happen and continue happening. The foundation was being laid for the remarkable young man he would become, built not on fame or destiny or magical power, but on the simple truth that he was worthy of love and care. "It is everything," she agreed quietly, "and it's only the beginning." Outside the window, the daffodils Harry had planted swayed in the evening breeze, bright yellow against the green of the garden. They would bloom again next spring, and the spring after that, reliable in their return as the seasons turned and the world renewed itself. And in 2 years' time, when an owl arrived with a letter addressed to Mr. H. Potter, he would be ready. Not because he had been told he was special, but because he had learned he was loved. Not because he carried the weight of others' expectations, but because he had discovered his own worth. The boy who lived had become the boy who belonged.